It was a day like any other, the kind where everything seems to be in order. A clear sky, the sound of distant traffic, and the usual hum of suburban life. But in one seemingly ordinary house, something extraordinary was unfolding. A baby, left behind with no one to care for it, lies abandoned in a small, dimly lit room. Its cries pierce the quiet, yet there is no one to answer. What's even more unsettling, though, is the presence of a dog. A lone, weathered creature, with eyes that seem to have seen too much. It stands at the baby's side, unwavering and protective, as though it has been placed there by fate itself. This is not a family pet, nor a stray passing by. There's something more to this animal's role, something that will soon reveal itself in ways no one could predict. The dog's actions are peculiar. Its vigilance, its stillness, its focus on the child. But it's not just the dog's protective behavior that is unnerving. It's the bond between them, something unspoken yet deeply felt. What could possibly drive a dog to remain by the side of an abandoned infant? What is it about this situation that binds them together in a way that defies logic and reason? As the minutes stretch into hours and the cries of the baby fade into the background, a story unfolds. One that will challenge everything you thought you knew about loyalty, protection, and the bond between a creature and a human life. What happens next is beyond comprehension, and it will leave you speechless. The small house sat on the edge of town, seemingly ordinary at first glance, but there was something unnerving about it. The once welcoming porch now looked worn, with peeling paint and a door that creaked on its hinges every time the wind passed through. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, but the house itself remained still, almost as if it were holding its breath. Inside, the air was thick with an unsettling silence, the kind of silence that seemed to hum with tension, as if someone was waiting. The walls, once bright and cheery, now held the marks of time and neglect, their surfaces coated with dust that made the house feel abandoned by more than just its owners. It was the sort of place where you couldn't help but feel a lingering unease, a sense that something was off. As you stepped across the threshold, a chill danced along your spine despite the warmth of the afternoon. And yet there was the sound, a soft rustling, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. Something or someone was moving inside. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a whispered warning. The dog's presence was unmistakable, yet there was no owner in sight. Just the dog, its eyes locked onto something no one else could see, its body taut with an unknown purpose. What was it guarding? Why was it here, in this eerily quiet home, waiting? The stillness of the house seemed to breathe with life, and the unsettling thought began to form. It wasn't just the house that had secrets. It was the dog, too. Lena stood at the front door of the house, the sun casting harsh shadows across her face. She wasn't sure what had drawn her to this place. It was almost as if something or someone had been calling her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to push open the creaking door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly behind her. And now here she was, standing in front of a house that had always been the subject of whispers in the town. Lena wasn't the type to get caught up in rumors. She had grown up in the small town, and after the tragic loss of her parents in a car accident, she had left to find a new life. Her father's sudden passing had left her with a deep sense of loss that she never quite shook. It was as if her entire world had collapsed in that moment, and nothing ever felt the same again. She had pushed herself to build a career as a freelance journalist, but the grief never quite left. She was constantly searching for something, anything that would give her peace. But deep inside, she had a nagging feeling that the answers might lie right here, in the house that had been abandoned for years. As Lena stepped inside, her gaze immediately locked onto the dog. The large, white German shepherd stood motionless in the corner of the room, watching her with intense, unblinking eyes. It was almost unnerving how still the animal remained. There was a tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if the dog knew something Lena didn't. She swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. "Hello, boy," she whispered, her voice shaking as she crouched down to meet the dog's gaze. The moment she spoke, The dog's posture relaxed slightly, but it remained in place, its eyes never leaving her. For a brief moment, Lena felt a strange connection. It was as if the dog recognized her, almost as though it understood her pain, her loss. She reached out a hand, but the dog didn't move. Instead, it shifted its weight slightly, as though making sure the space between them remained undisturbed. Lena had heard the rumors about this place. How the family who had lived here had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind everything, including the dog. No one knew what had happened to them. Some said they'd left in the middle of the night. Others claimed something darker had occurred. But Lena wasn't here for the rumors. She needed answers. She needed to know why the house had been abandoned, why the dog remained. As Lena stood there, something in her chest tightened. She felt it. The pull, the strange magnetic force that kept her here, tethered to this house. Maybe it was her desperation for closure, or maybe it was the strange feeling of being watched by the dog. Either way, she knew she couldn't leave yet. There was a story to uncover, and the dog, this eerie, silent guardian, held the key. Lena stood frozen, the stillness of the house closing in around her. The dog, still watching her with those piercing eyes, had not moved an inch. A shiver ran down her spine as a strange chill swept through the room. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just the draft from the broken windows or the decay of the old house. But something about this place felt wrong. "Why are you still here?" she muttered to herself, more out of frustration than anything else. It had been years since the family had vanished, and yet the house remained, untouched, unclaimed, and the dog, loyal as ever, was still here, waiting. It didn't make sense. She turned away from the dog for a moment, scanning the room. Dust had settled on every surface, the furniture covered in white sheets, like the ghosts of lives that once filled the house. It was a scene frozen in time, and Lena couldn't shake the sense that it was more than just a mere abandonment. There was a story here, a mystery begging to be solved. Lena made her way through the house, her footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. She moved cautiously, almost reverently, as though stepping through a fragile memory. She passed by old family portraits hanging crookedly on the walls, the faces of strangers staring back at her. She couldn't help but feel an odd connection to them. Something about their expressions seemed desperate, as though they knew something she didn't. Her mind kept racing, each thought spiraling into 100 different possibilities. She wasn't sure why she was so fixated on this house, but the more she uncovered, the more she felt compelled to dig deeper. She could feel the weight of the air around her, thick with the secrets it held. Suddenly, she heard the sound of scratching at the floor behind her. Spinning around, she saw the dog had moved, slowly pacing toward her, dragging its paws across the floor as if reluctant to get closer. Its eyes never left her, and Lena's heart skipped a beat. The tension in the air was unbearable, but there was something about the dog's presence that made her feel both at ease and on edge at the same time. "What do you want from me?" Lena whispered, half to herself and half to the animal. She knew it couldn't answer her, but she was desperate for any kind of sign that she was on the right path. The dog's tail gave a slight wag, but it didn't approach any further. Frustrated, Lena stepped deeper into the house, ignoring the dog's gaze as best as she could. She needed answers. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on a staircase leading up to the second floor. It was covered in dust, the wood groaning as she carefully ascended, her breath shallow as she climbed. Upstairs, the air was thicker. The rooms felt closed off, oppressive. There was no natural light filtering in through the windows, leaving everything bathed in a gray, shadowy gloom. She moved from room to room, each more unsettling than the last. Every step seemed to amplify the eerie feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. The walls whispered secrets she couldn't hear, but her gut told her they were there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. She stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway, the door slightly ajar, creaking faintly as though it had not been opened in years. Something about it seemed off. She could feel her pulse quicken as she pushed the door open, stepping into the room beyond. It was a child's bedroom. A crib sat against one wall, The thin mattress yellowed with age. Dolls and stuffed animals lay scattered on the floor, their glass eyes staring vacantly at the walls. The air was stale, the smell of old wood and forgotten memories clinging to everything. But it wasn't just the room that made Lena's skin crawl. It was the feeling that something had been left behind here. A presence, a loss, something unspoken. Then she saw it. A small, tattered blanket lay at the foot of the crib. It was nothing more than a scrap of fabric, faded and worn. But there was something about it that made Lena's heart race. As she stepped closer, she felt a sudden pressure in her chest, as if the room was closing in on her. She reached down and picked it up, noticing the faint traces of a small handprint on the fabric, the edges of the blanket stained with something that looked like blood. Lena's mind went blank for a moment as she stared at the blanket in her hands. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just an abandoned house. It was a place where something had happened, something horrible. The family hadn't just left. They had been torn apart. Where did they go? She whispered, her voice trembling. She turned to leave the room, but before she could reach the door, she heard it again, the scratching sound. It was louder this time, almost frantic. She spun around, but the dog was nowhere to be seen. The sudden silence that followed felt even more oppressive, as if something had changed in the air, the house now aware of her presence. Lena backed away, fear creeping into her chest. She needed to get out of here, but her curiosity kept her rooted to the spot. She couldn't leave without knowing what happened to this family. There were too many unanswered questions. And as she glanced back to the stairwell, she caught sight of the dog again, standing in the hallway just beyond the threshold of the door, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. She wasn't alone. And somehow, she knew the dog had been waiting for her all along. It wasn't just guarding the house, it was guarding the truth. Lena stood frozen in the doorway, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. The dog's glowing eyes seemed to pierce through the dim hallway, but there was something in its gaze that made her hesitate. The presence of the animal felt different now, like it was no longer just an observer. It was guarding something, something that she had yet to understand. The air around her grew heavier, thicker with tension, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sent a chill crawling up her spine. Lena knew she couldn't stay here forever, but she also knew that leaving now would feel like abandoning the only lead she had. The dog didn't move. It just stood there, its gaze unwavering, almost as if it was daring her to take the next step. Lena felt the strange pull to move forward, to find out what lay hidden beyond the dog's watchful eyes. "Why are you still here?" she whispered, her voice strained, as though speaking too loudly would break the fragile tension surrounding them. But the dog remained silent, offering no answers. She took a step toward it, each movement slow, deliberate, as though she were treading through the thinnest of ice. Her hand hovered near the banister, the wood slick with age, the faintest remnants of old varnish peeling away. The dog's tail twitched slightly, a subtle movement, but it was enough to make her pause. A sudden crash from upstairs shattered the stillness, the sound like something heavy falling to the floor. Lena's heart skipped a beat. The dog didn't flinch. It didn't move. Instead, it remained poised, as though it knew the sound would come, as though it had been expecting it. Lena's pulse quickened as a cold sweat formed on her brow. Was it another warning, or was this something more? She hesitated, staring at the dog in disbelief. "What's up there?" she asked, barely a whisper. She knew it was ridiculous, but in that moment, the dog felt like it held the answers. Answers that she couldn't afford to ignore. The scratching noise returned, this time from somewhere further down the hall, its irregular rhythm making her skin crawl. It was a noise that didn't belong in the world she knew. It was raw, desperate, and unnerving. Lena instinctively took a step back, but the dog remained perfectly still, its gaze locked on hers. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. She glanced at the hallway beyond the dog. The house seemed to groan under the pressure, the walls exhaling whispers she couldn't quite make out. She looked at the dog again. There was something in the way it held itself now, something almost protective. But why had it stayed? Why hadn't it left? Then, for the first time, the dog moved, though it did so with an unnatural calmness, almost like a puppet on invisible strings. It took a few steps back, its eyes not leaving hers. And suddenly, the silence that had settled over the house felt suffocating. Lena's breath quickened, her mind racing. Should she follow the dog's movement? Or should she turn and flee? Every instinct screamed for her to leave, to run out of this place and never look back. But the nagging voice inside her told her that the answer, whatever it was just beyond her reach. A soft, almost imperceptible whimper echoed from the corner of the hallway. Lena's head snapped in that direction, her body instinctively leaning forward, her curiosity driving her closer. There, in the shadows near the old wooden door, something moved. It was the faintest trace of a figure, a human-like shape, but too distorted, too fluid to be real. She blinked, and it was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it real? Had she imagined it? She scanned the hallway once more, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Then, the door creaked open just slightly, barely a crack, as though inviting her in. The smell of stale air and decay seemed to seep out from within, thick and heavy. But it wasn't just the scent that made her stomach churn. It was the feeling of something else, something far more sinister, lurking behind that door. For a moment, Lena stood motionless, her heart hammering in her chest. She felt the weight of the house press down on her, as though it were watching her, judging her decision. The sudden urge to turn and leave was nearly overwhelming, but the dog's presence at her back, silent and unwavering, held her in place. It had been waiting for her to come here, to uncover whatever this place was hiding. The scratching stopped. Lena didn't know what to think anymore. The dog's calm, steady presence beside her almost made her feel like she was being guided. But there was no doubt that something terrible had happened in this house. A dark past that had left its mark, not just on the family, but on the very foundation of the house itself. The door creaked again, but this time it opened wider. Something on the other side moved, slow, deliberate, as if it were getting ready to step out. Lena took one hesitant step forward, the air now thick with anticipation. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door, her breath catching in her throat. But just before she could push it fully open, the dog let out a low growl, a sound deep in its chest, one that sent a shock of fear through her. The growl wasn't meant for her. It was meant for whatever lay hidden beyond that door. Something inside the house, something not quite human, was waiting for her to make the wrong move. Lena's hand hovered over the door handle, her heart racing in her chest. The low growl from the dog sent ripples of dread through her body, and her instincts screamed at her to turn and run. But she couldn't. She had come this far, and something deep inside her told her that the answers lay beyond that door. If she turned away now, she would never know the truth. The dog's growl deepened, its body tensing beside her as though it were preparing to spring into action. A flash of movement caught her eye, and her breath hitched. The shadow from earlier, the one she had only glimpsed, was back, this time much clearer. The figure was unmistakable now. A human-like shape, distorted, with limbs that stretched too long, too thin. It crept from the corner of the hallway, its eyes hollow, black voids in a face that seemed frozen in a grotesque grimace. The room beyond the door felt like it was breathing, pulsing with an unnatural energy. The figure moved closer, its steps slow, deliberate, as if testing Lena's resolve. The growl from the dog escalated to a bark, sharp, commanding. But it wasn't just a warning. It was a cry for action, a call to fight, not flee. Lena's hand clenched around the door handle. She had no choice now. She needed to face whatever had been hiding in this house, whatever had been waiting for her to uncover the secrets buried here. She shoved the door open, and the air inside the room hit her like a cold wave. The space beyond was suffocating. The walls lined with old furniture draped in white sheets, their surfaces coated in layers of dust. But in the farthest corner of the room, she saw it, a crib. A small, wooden crib, empty now, but its presence spoke volumes. The figure she had seen in the hallway emerged into the room, Its shadow stretched across the floor like a living thing. The dog, now fully alert, stepped into the room with her. Its eyes locked on the shadow, its body taut with warning. Lena took a step forward, her feet moving almost against her will, her breath shallow. The figure stopped moving. A thick silence enveloped the room, heavy and thick, suffocating. Who are you?" Lena whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Her voice shook, but she couldn't pull back now. She had to know. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, its hollow eyes narrowing as though it were studying her. Then, in an instant, the temperature in the room plummeted. Lena's breath fogged in the air as an icy chill wrapped around her, and the shadow in the corner flickered, as though it were shifting between dimensions. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to look away. "Tell me what happened here," she demanded. "Who were you protecting? Who was in the crib?" The figure's lips stretched into a grotesque smile, and for the briefest moment, Lena thought she saw something familiar in its face. A memory, perhaps, from her own past. It was only a fleeting sensation, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. Suddenly, the dog lunged, its sharp teeth bared as it attacked the figure. The shadow recoiled, but it didn't fight back. Instead, it faded, disintegrating into the air like smoke, leaving nothing behind but the cold, eerie emptiness of the room. Lena gasped, stumbling back as the dog stood over her, its protective stance unwavering. The figure was gone. There was only the silence now, and the weight of the truth hanging in the air. The crib. She turned toward it, her breath hitching. The old wooden crib still sat in the corner, its frame aged and worn, but there was something else now, something new. A small, torn piece of fabric lay on the floor next to it, stained with something dark and dried. Her eyes widened as she knelt to pick it up. It was a small patch of baby clothes, a onesie perhaps long since forgotten. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The crib wasn't just an empty relic of the past. It was a symbol of loss, of tragedy. The figure, the shadow, hadn't been some malevolent force. It had been a mother, a protector, bound to this place by the tragic end of her child's life. The crib was a monument to a life cut short, a life that had been taken too soon. The dog stood silently beside her, its eyes soft now, no longer sharp with warning. It had been the protector just as the figure had been. It had known what needed to be done. Lena's hands trembled as she wiped away the dust on the crib's edge, her fingers brushing against the forgotten memories that had been buried in this house for so long. She understood now. The dog hadn't been guarding the crib out of instinct. It had been guarding the memory of a lost child, a story that had been buried in the shadows of the past. The house, too, seemed to exhale, as though it had finally been released from its long, oppressive hold. The oppressive air, the haunting atmosphere, the tension that had seemed so thick. It was lifting. The dog let out a soft whine, nudging her gently, as though urging her to leave. Lena stood, her heart heavy with the weight of the revelation, her eyes lingering on the crib for a moment longer before she turned and left the room. The house felt different now, quieter, as though it had let go of its secrets. As she walked out of the room, the dog trotted beside her, its mission complete. Outside, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Lena glanced back at the house, its once ominous silhouette now softened by the fading light of day. She wasn't sure what would happen next or what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. The house had given up its darkest secret, and with it, the possibility of peace. But as Lena walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still parts of the story left untold, waiting in the silence of the house. And though she had uncovered much, she knew the truth was never quite finished. There was always another chapter, another revelation, just beyond the horizon. As Lena walked away from the house, the weight of what she had uncovered hung heavily in her chest. The dog, still by her side, was now a silent companion, a protector who had seen the truth unfold. But Lena felt different, changed. It wasn't just the revelation about the lost child, or the presence of the haunting figure that lingered in the shadows. It was the realization that some secrets are meant to be unearthed, not to hurt, but to heal. She thought about the mother, the figure who had once roamed those halls, a spirit bound by grief and love for a child she could no longer protect. Lena had entered the house searching for answers, but what she found was something much deeper, an understanding that some stories aren't just about the past. They shape who we are in the present and what we become in the future. The dog had been guarding more than just a crib. It had been guarding the memory of love, loss, and the unyielding bond between a mother and her child. And in a way, it had guarded Lena too, her own need to understand, to connect, to find the truth behind the walls of that old house. Lena paused at the edge of the yard, looking back one last time at the house that had kept its secrets for so long. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but now she knew the house's story was not one of fear. It was a story of redemption, of closure, and of the powerful force of love that transcended even death. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lena let out a long, steady breath. She had found peace, but she also knew that some questions would never be fully answered. And maybe that was okay. Perhaps the journey was the answer itself, one of healing, understanding, and the enduring strength of the heart. What do we really know about the things we fear the most? Maybe, just maybe, it's not the dark that we should fear, but the secrets that lie within it. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts with us in the comments below. What do you think happened to the dog and the child? Do you have any predictions for the next part of this mystery? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our upcoming stories, filled with suspense, eerie mysteries, and unexpected twists. Join the community and stay tuned for more spine-tingling tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are just waiting to be discovered.